one of the most important things to realize about reading is that it is a fairly new invention in human history. A couple of millennia old, only after the invention of the alphabet. And for a long time, reading was really just a kind of adjunct to oral communication, because, most of human history, we just conversed and exchanged information through speech. And so one of the fascinating things about early writing on slates, on papyrus, even on early handwritten books, is, for instance, there were no spaces between the words. People just wrote in continuous script. And that's because that's the way we hear speech. When somebody's talking to us, they're not carefully putting pauses between words. It all flows together. The problem with that, though, is it's very hard to read. A lot of your mental energy goes to figuring out where does one word end and the next begin. And as a result, all reading was done in the early years out loud. There was no such thing as silent reading because you had to read out loud in order to figure out, where is a word ending and where is a word beginning. And it was only in around the year 800 or 900 that we saw the introduction of word spaces. And suddenly, reading became, in a sense, easier. And suddenly you had the arrival of silent reading, which changed the act of reading from just transcription of speech to something that every individual did on their own. And suddenly you had this whole ideal of the silent, solitary reader who was improving their mind, expanding their horizons, and so forth. And when Gutenberg invented the printing press around 1450, what that served to do is take this new, very attentive, very deep form of reading, which had been limited to just, monasteries and universities, and by making books much cheaper and much more available, spread that way of reading out to a much larger mass audience. And so we saw, for the last 500 years or so, one of the central facts of culture was deep, solitary reading, the immersion of ourselves in books, in long articles, and so forth. With the transfer now of text more and more onto screens, we see, I think, a new and in some ways more primitive way of reading. In order to take in information off a screen when you're also being bombarded by all sorts of other information, and when there's links in the text where you have to think, even just for a fraction of a second, do I click on this link or not? Suddenly, reading again becomes a more cognitively intensive act, the way it was back when there were no spaces between words. And as a result, I think we begin to lose the ability to read in the deepest, most interpretive ways, because we're not kind of calming our mind and just focusing on the argument or the story.